Hi, my name is Jennifer Koch, and I'm a research scientist with the Northern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service. Thanks for joining me in this overview of Forest Service forest tree breeding programs. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge Carrie Pike for helping me put together the slideshow and this presentation. Since this is the plant breeding stakeholders meeting, most of what you might have heard has been about crop breeding or plant breeding, so I wanted to start by talking about some of the differences between forest tree breeding programs and crop breeding, because trees are very different. They're long-lived, can live hundreds of years to thousands of years, so the traits that we breed for must be durable over both time and the changing climate that can occur over that lifespan. Genomes of trees are enormous compared to those of crops. Corn is 2.5 million base pairs, whereas pine is 22 billion base pairs. And there's an information deficit in trees relative to crops. So very little omics type information is available on our U.S. forest tree species. Although there's a few species, mostly of commercial value, that have enough information that they are near the point of applying technologies such as gene editing or genomic selection. But our focus is primarily on phenotyping and the identification of resistant trees, because our current threat of our forests is the myriad of damaging insects and diseases that our trees face. The deployment of resistant trees by the Forest Service breeding programs that's being accomplished to date, and I'll tell you about some of those successes, was done with phenotyping alone and without any of these technologies, although certainly in the future these technologies could help assist with this. Initial phenotypes, especially for resistance, can be very subtle and can be difficult to find. Resistance can require exhaustive searches where you wait for all the other trees to die and look for those rare survivor trees, or labor-intense monitoring efforts to understand mortality trends. And this is the way that we discovered that ash trees that survive emerald ash borer infestation for just a few years longer than the rest of the trees in the stand actually have some level of resistance. So despite these subtle phenotypes, the genetic gain through breeding is still possible, but that can be challenging as well. You can see that in the pictures shown on this slide. Breeding can be difficult and require equipment to lift you 80, 100 feet in the air to do controlled cross-pollinations. Some systems, like pine, cone production can take 2 years. Another big difference between crop and forestry breeding is the goal for the end product. With crops, genetic uniformity is what's desired. But with forestry breeding, our goal is to maintain genetic diversity. We want a genetic diverse seed source that's improved for resistance to put out on the landscape so that it can continue to evolve under the natural selection of the pest that we've bred for resistance. In addition, we also want there to be enough genetic variation left in the survivors that we put out there for the population to be resilient enough to persist through changing climate and facing new insects, diseases, and other stressors. So the bottom line is we really want to prevent extinction of these species. So when we're breeding, although genetic diversity is definitely one of our key goals, the extent of genetic diversity, and it's always a balance between genetic diversity and genetic gain, and that varies depending on the breeding goal. So in this table, in the first column, we talk about urban areas where we would breed for landscape and street trees. And these are usually clonal, which means that they're not self-sustaining. They're either going to die or be cut down and replanted. So we don't require that genetic diversity, that extensive genetic diversity. We're willing to sacrifice genetic diversity to get the traits that we want, the aesthetics of, fall color or flowers, or just to make sure that we have urban trees giving us the ecosystem services that we need. Examples of some Forest Service programs developing cultivars, including those in elm, ash, and Port Orford cedar. In production forestry, again, self-sustaining populations are not the goal, so we can have lower genetic diversity, and we are also, again, willing to sacrifice genetic diversity for the breeding objectives. And in these types of systems, that's growth rate, stem form, and things like that. So we're talking here about needing maybe a medium level of genetic diversity for these commercial species. But when we're talking about restoration forestry, in our natural forests or even urban forests and rural riparian buffer zones, this is where we really need that high level of genetic diversity. We need the population that we put out there to be self-sustaining. So they're going to have a long lifespan, and over that long lifespan, they're going to have to face all those stresses that I've talked about: changing climate, droughts, other insects, and so forth. So for now, this has been the primary focus of Forest Service breeding programs, although we still do a natural offshoot of restoration breeding is the development of cultivars, and the Forest Service still does have sort of a supportive role in production forestry, but that is primarily now driven by academia and the private sector. When I talk about breeding for forest restoration, one of the biggest challenges is restoration of species that are impacted, like that have ranges that expand almost the entire United States, like the map that's shown on this slide of green ash. So when we're breeding for resistance, as I had mentioned, you go to your natural stand, which is full of genetically diverse trees, but we want to pick the trees that are surviving emerald ash borer. Go through a series of selection, breeding, testing, put your best trees in a seed orchard, and the seed orchard would produce improved seedlings that maintain that genetic diversity that you can then start restoration plantings. But for example, I'm located here in Ohio, so the materials that I have from Ohio and Michigan wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for planting throughout this entire range of green ash. So in order to accomplish range-wide restoration, this process of developing seed orchards has to be replicated with new genotypes throughout the range of the species to capture those adaptive traits. The good thing about that is that once this is accomplished, we have seed sources with known origin, and we know the climate of the origin of those trees, so that information can assist us in developing assisted migration strategies. And this is just a map showing you where the Forest Service tree breeding activities are going on. It's color-coded to indicate that all three branches of the Forest Service are involved in some aspects of tree breeding. On the west, it's mostly the National Forest System with primarily the Dorina Genetic Resource Center. In the east, we have more involvement from research and development, both in the Northern and Southern Research Station, but also support from the National Forest and state and private forestry. Next, I want to give an overview of some of the breeding programs that we have that are ongoing. I wanted to start with the Dorina Genetic Resource Center because this is our largest breeding program, and at 54 years of age, I'm pretty sure it's our oldest. It was initially started to develop white pine blister rust to western white pine and sugar pine, and it eventually expanded to all 8 western species of 5-needle pines. And they're currently deploying a resistant planting stock for 3 pine species, as well as Port Orford cedar. And cultivar development evaluation is currently ongoing for Port Orford cedar as well. So with a place like Dorina, with stable funding, infrastructure, skilled personnel, it gives you the ability to rapidly expand when there's a new species facing a new invasive threat. And that enables them to provide critical guidance to the acacia koa wilt and rapid ohia death resistance programs in Hawaii. And they're currently collaborating with the Northern Research Station to screen Oregon ash for EAB resistance. And that's proactively. EAB hasn't even reached Oregon yet, but wouldn't that be great to be able to have resistant plants already ready to go and be planted before it gets there? So that's an overview of Dorina, and I wanted to take a closer look at their program with Southwestern White Pine because the theme of this year's plant breeding stakeholders meeting is climate change. And this program is linking blister rust resistance screening with adaptive traits. And this slide is just showing that this is typical of most of our breeding programs. wide-ranging partnership. This in particular is a national and international collaborative effort, initially funded with some state and private forestry money, but an NSF funding allowed them to expand to this large international collaboration. So the project started by doing seed collections range wide and all the way down into Mexico. And the seed lots that are collected are being screened at Dorina for white pine blister rust, and at the same time being evaluated for adaptive traits. And this slide here is showing that happening at Northern Arizona University. So the really great thing about this is the management implications of the information that will come out of this. So not only will we learn about genetic conservation, where resistance is located, what trees we want to preserve, but learning about adaptation will inform, as well as the resistance breeding, will inform seed zone considerations and tell us what is good to plant where, how far can seed be moved, which seed sources do better when moved where, based on those adaptive traits, and maybe areas where it's best to just focus on natural regeneration. Now on the East Coast, one of our successful breeding programs that we're actually deploying resistance is the American Beech Breeding Program for Beech Bark Disease Resistance. In 10 years from the beginning of this program, we were able to identify resistant trees in natural stands, confirm heritability using genetic studies, and also verify resistance phenotypes through tests, and that's shown in these photos over here. We've established seed orchards and are now deploying resistance. And this slide is showing one of our restoration plantings with a group of volunteers at the Ludington State Park. And this picture, this is kind of cool. This is 3 generations of campers who were out that day and volunteered to help us plant these disease-resistant trees at the aptly named Beechwood Campground, where beech bark disease had killed a lot of their the beech trees. So again, a wide array of partners are necessary to get this kind of work done. Although we've had success with beech bark disease, we still risk losing the beech hemlock forest type. Over the past several years, there's been several publications coming out about this beech leaf disease, which is now known to be caused by a nematode species new to the US. Plus, eastern hemlock is faced with invasive hemlock woolly adelgid, as well as the elongate hemlock scale. Now, the Northern Research Station is working with partners to monitor beech leaf disease, to look for resistance, and we are also working with partners to establish an eastern hemlock breeding program. A lot of people remember American elm as being one of those great, tall, vase-like street trees that used to line our streets all over the country. And so our breeding program for Dutch elm disease resistance is something that is often of great interest. Not only are we working in this project to develop cultivars for the use to replace as street trees, but also breeding for restoration in rural landscapes, and incorporating breeding to be adapted to different climates. So these are just showing, you know, a map of reports from people that they can go online and let us know where they found a large surviving tree, some of the elm plantings in the process of inoculating these trees. So again, a successful program at this point. Elm was an important riparian species, and when Dutch elm disease came through, it was largely replaced by ash, which is now being threatened by emerald ash borer. So our ash breeding program is critical to these sensitive riparian areas, but it's also of interest because it's also not just about the species, but it's about the entire genus. So the North American ash species, green, white, blue, black, and pumpkin, have all been declared as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. So these are trees, ash trees used to be among the most commonly planted street trees, so impacts on the nursery and landscape industry. In agroforestry, ash was commonly used in windbreaks, especially in the Great Plains, where there were very few species that can survive the conditions there, and also in riparian buffer zones. And this photo is showing a bunch of dead ash right by this stream, and you can see the farm planted area there. In northern black ash forest wetlands, EAB threatens the conversion of forests to open marsh at a time where we're having discussions about the need for planting trees and, reforestation to mitigate the effects of climate change. So wide-ranging impacts from that invasive insect. This slide is just showing how our breeding program is testing trees to determine if they have resistance to emerald ash borer. So the lingering ash is the tree that has survived a little bit longer than everybody else. We graft replicates of that and put eggs on it. And after a couple of weeks, we then dissect and trace the feeding gallery of the larvae and determine if the larvae is healthy or if it's been killed by a host defense response. Just this year and last year were the first rounds of testing progeny of where both parents were selected as lingering ash, and we've gotten some of the progeny that have been able to kill up to 80 to 100% of the larvae. So this gives us great hope for saving green ash, and we hope that it's applicable to the other species as well. So I want to end by talking about the opportunity that is created because the genetic resources created by Forest Service tree breeding programs are really in demand. But the problem that we have is that decline in federal and state nurseries and breeding capacity can't keep up with the demand for resistant seed for restoration, nor for the seed sources that will be needed for assisted migration. The solution, however, and I've hinted at that, pointing out a lot of the partnerships that go along with all of the efforts that I described, but the solution is to keep establishing these public-private participatory breeding networks. Our partners really look to the Forest Service for leadership, and they're willing to contribute through cost sharing, through labor and land to establish and maintain progeny tests, seed orchards. We have volunteer citizens who volunteer to help with restoration plantings, also to monitor and report resistant trees, and our academic partners. Using our pedigreed and phenotyped families of trees allows them to tap into additional grant sources and help bridge that information gap between forest trees and crops so that we can further research and get closer to using those technologies and accelerate breeding and restoration and maybe be able to use something like genomic selection or gene editing in some of our species. And I wanted to end with letting you know about one of our exciting new breeding program networks, partner networks. It's called the Roots of Rock. And this was sort of born out of an idea from Fender Guitar, who uses ash wood to produce their guitars. And you can see in this picture, Keith Richards is actually playing a Fender guitar made with ash wood. And when his 30th anniversary solo album was released, he wanted an ash wood box for the album, and that's shown in this picture here, so that it looked like the guitar that he actually played. American Forests was one of our original partners too. And since then, it's grown. We now include Greening of Detroit. Holden Forests and Gardens is going to play an important role in this project, and it keeps growing. The idea behind it is to leverage the music industry to spark a nationwide movement for forest restoration. We want to engage partners, provide educational opportunities, and on the research side, technology transfer for the methods that we develop to breed and test for resistance and get that into the hands of people that will actually be carrying it out on the ground. So we want to use ash to create a template so people know what to do when that next invasive comes along. The steps that you follow to identify and develop resistance, and once you've developed resistance, how do you build a network to establish a pipeline to get to operational range-wide restoration, which is a massive undertaking for such a wide-ranging species. But the great thing is that once you've built this template and we've built these networks, we can easily plug in the next species that's threatened and start all over again and use tree breeding to address other forest health issues. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. I didn't touch on all of the programs. I'm ending with this slide. Maybe you can get a screenshot because there's links and some additional information on some of the species that I didn't get to. But again, thanks for your time.